Accordingly, they subvert the Christian ideal of Jesus' resurrection by having him punished forever in hell, and by making clear that this fate awaits his followers as well, who believe in this impostor. There is no resurrection, they insist, not for him and not for his followers. In other words, there is no justification whatsoever for this Christian sect that impudently claims to be the new covenant, and that is on its way to establish itself as a new religion. And the author goes on to state that most remarkably, they counter the New Testament passion story with its message of the Jews' guilt and shame as Christ killers. Instead, they reverse it completely. They maintain we accept responsibility for it, but there is no reason to feel ashamed because we rightfully executed a blasphemer and idolater. Jesus deserved death, and he got what he deserved. Now, I'm going to show you a clip because you'll encounter this.
Christ, I'd do it again. I'd fucking do it again in a second.
That clip was actually from Sarah Silverman doing a stand-up comedy act some years ago. And that's what I mean. Like, it's not uncommon to hear that. Say, oh, Jesus is in the Talmud and he's burning an excrement in Hades or Sheol. The common response is going to be, well, no, he's not. That's not about the Jesus from the Bible. Instead, you'll hear a lot of, well, we don't really know who it was. It's a character. It's not even related to that. Oh, it's not the same one. But obviously, as you're going to find out here, the claims in the Babylonian Talmud that Jesus was in fact an illegitimate child, or his mother was a common whore. I'm going to show you a clip from one of the Jewish people, and they actually confirm it. So, to me, it's pretty clear-cut. A pungent counter-argument against evangelicals' narrative is, of course, the assertion of Jesus' illegitimate birth from an adulterous mother and some insignificant lover. Now, it parries the claim of Jesus' noble Davidic lineage, to which the New Testament attaches such great value. And hence is the Davidic Messiah. He was born in Bethlehem, the city of David. And the Jewish counter-narrative actually argues that this is all just nonsense. He is anything but a noble origins, right? His father was by no means a descendant of David, but the otherwise unknown Pantera or Pandera, which was a Roman soldier, in other words, a non-Jew, and a member of the hated Roman Empire that so visibly and horribly oppressed the Jews. Now, much worse in turning Jesus into a bastard is the counter-narrative that takes up the contradictions of the New Testament story about Jesus' origin and ridicules the claim that he was born from a virgin. The New Testament itself is remarkably vague about this claim. Matthew, having established Jesus' genealogy from Abraham down to Joseph, concludes with Jacob, who fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who is called Messiah. Mary, Joseph's legal wife, had a secret lover, and that her child was just a bastard like any other bastard, and Joseph's suspicion, whether he was Mary's husband or her betrothed, was absolutely warranted. Mary had indeed been unfaithful to him. He should have dismissed her immediately, as was customary according to Jewish law at that time. Now, this powerful counter-narrative shakes the foundations of the Christian message. It is not just a malicious distortion of the birth story. Rather, it posits the whole idea of Jesus' Davidic descent, his claim to be the Messiah, and ultimately his claim to be the Son of God, are based on fraud. Most striking, this counter, New Testament in a nutshell, has been preserved in rabbinic sources only in the Babylonian Talmud, and there almost in passing. And when you bring up this story, the same response will be, well, we don't know if it's about Jesus. It's not really about him. That's what some will say, but then if you talk to this gentleman, you're going to hear this.
מאיפה אנחנו יודעים בעצם? זה מובן בתלמוד הבבלי. אוקיי, מה כתוב? שמי התעברה, כתוב שם מי התעברה, אני לא זוכר בדיוק את השם, אם תרצה, אני... יכול להיות יוסף, היה לו בעל יוסף. אני לא זוכר מי התעברה. בסדר, גם אני לא מומחה בזה, אוקיי. אבל יש לו עמדה ספציפית ביהדות, נגיד באסלאם, יש לו עמדה ספציפית כפרופט. את תורת ישוע אני לא מכיר, אני לא יודע מה העמדה שלו לגבי היהדות. אוקיי. אוקיי, ואני מניח למה הם שואלים, וזה למה אנחנו לא מאמינים בישו כהמשיח. אתה יכול לדבר על זה. למה אנחנו לא מאמינים שמה? שהוא המשיח. למה כן? למה שנאמין?
The most explicit passages that are talking about Jesus as a person appear only in the Babylonian Talmud around the 3rd or 4th century or so. The first, the Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmud, was edited in 5th century Palestine, and the second, the Babylonian Talmud, reached its final form in the early 7th century. It opens with Onkelos, who is the alleged translator of the Hebrew Bible. He is wondering if he should convert to Judaism. And he decides to bring up, by means of necromancy, 3 arch-villains of Jewish history. He decides to bring them out of their graves to get their informed advice. So you have Titus, the destroyer of the Second Temple, Balaam, the prophet of the nations, and Jesus the Nazarene, who is quite dubious, however, because in some versions of the Talmud, he is replaced by the broad category of the sinners of Israel. And all three are obviously in the netherworld, the biblical Sheol, where they are punished for their grave misdeeds. And this is the exchange that happens between Onkelos and Jesus, or the sinners of Israel, which was changed later on, answered Israel. Onkelos says, what about then joining them? And Jesus replies, seek their welfare, seek not their harm. Whoever touches them is as though he touches the apple of God's eye. What is your punishment? And Jesus, or the sinners of Israel, answers with boiling excrement. For the master has said, whoever mocks the words of the sages is punished with boiling excrement. Come and see the difference between the sinners of Israel and the prophets of the Gentile nations. So what is it then that our archvillains of Jewish history did? And how are they punished? Because obviously, the punishment stands in direct relationship to their crime committed against Israel. So in Titus's case, it was the simplest of all three. He has burned the temple to ashes and has fittingly decreed that after his death he shall be burned, and his ashes be scattered over the seas. His punishment consists of his body being reassembled and burnt, and his ashes being scattered over the seas over and over again, literally forever, as the Tosefta tells us. Now, Balaam's sin, of course, is his attempt to curse Israel. What about his punishment in boiling semen? This could be inferred from the biblical account of Israel attaching itself to the god Baal, whose worship entailed, according to the Bible, whoring with the women and eating sacrifices offered to the dead. The former is regarded as indulging in orgies connected with the worship of Baal. And since Baal enticed Israel into the sexual transgression, he is appropriately punished in the netherworld by sitting on boiling semen. And lastly, we have Jesus, or the sinners of Israel. And you might be wondering, we didn't really hear anything of his crime, and we can't explain the punishment, which is kind of bizarre, right? However, we can safely assume with prior knowledge of the other texts that are in this book, that it must have had to do with idolatry and blasphemy, right? The first and obvious possibility that comes to mind is with the Pharisees in the New Testament, when the Pharisees ask why Jesus' disciples do not wash their hands before they eat. And Jesus explains to the crowd following him that it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles. And that is as follows: do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, false witness, and slander. These are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile. So Jesus was apparently arguing that the Pharisaic purity rules don't really matter. What is important is not the purity of the hands and of the food, because food is processed within the body, and any inherent impurity will be excreted and ends up in the sewer, but the purity of the heart, because it is processed in the mouth and when uttered, starts a fatal life of its own. In other words, not food is impure, but human intentions and actions are impure. So the rabbinic counternarrative about Jesus' punishment would then ironically invert his attack on the Pharisaic purity laws by having him sit in excrement and teaching him, as well as his followers, the lesson: you believe that only what comes out of the mouth defiles. Well, you will sit in your own excrement and will fully understand that also what goes into the mouth and comes out of the stomach defiles. Before we get into the idolatry and blasphemy charges, I actually want to show you guys some video clips of Jewish folks themselves confirming this. Now, mind you, most of them are ultra-Orthodox Jews.
אם הם עובדי עבודה זרה, אז אנחנו צריכים לרמוס בהם ולשקט אותם ולרמוס אותם ובעיקרון גם להרוג אותם, כי הרי גוי חייב בשבע מצוות בנוח, ואם הוא לא מקיים את זה צריך להרוג אותו. אבל אתה תהרוג מישהו? אם הייתי יכול הייתי מוצא לעשות את זה, אבל אין לנו בית דין, אז אנחנו לא יכולים לעשות את זה.
זה שמישהו מאמין בישו ונצרות וזה,
אז צריך להרוג אותו.
בינתיים, אוקיי, אבל אין בית דין.
אז לא עושים את זה.
אז זה בסדר לירוק על מישהו כזה?
אמרתי, אם זה גורם תועלת, אז כן, אם לא, אז לא. בגלל זה עבודה זרה, אם הוא יתרחק מהעניין.
אבל זה אמונה של מישהו אחר.
זה אמונה שמישהו מאמין בה, צריך להרוג אותו.
מי שמאמין שהאלוהים שלי הוא חלק מאיש, אז צריך להרוג אותו. מי שמזלזל באלוהים שלי, אז אני אהרוג אותו.
אז זה לא, אבל זה תפקיד שלכם. להרוג או לרעוק, זה לא התפקיד של אלוהים?
לא, השם אומר לנו מה לעשות.
הוא אומר, זה כתוב, להרוג? איפה?
היהדות תפקידה בעולם זה לעשות טוב, לגרום שהעולם יהיה נקי. אז כל אדם שיאמין באיזה בן זונה אחד.
So now we're going to take a look at idolatry and blasphemy within the Babylonian Talmud, and it says how closely magic and idolatry are connected in the Jewish perception of Jesus. It becomes apparent in the Bibli story of Jesus' execution. This is his crime. He practiced sorcery and instigated and seduced Israel. Publicly, Jesus was explicitly accused of both. He did his disastrous and abhorrent work in secret as well as openly, and hence deserves the death penalty even twice. His particular variety of idolatry affected and threatened the whole community of Israel. The worst idolater is someone who propagates not just some pagan gods, horrible enough, but only too well known to the rabbis, but declares himself God or the Son of God. This falls under the category of blasphemy, which according to the Bible deserves the death penalty of stoning. And he who blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall stone him. As he who is born in the land, when he blasphemes the name of the Lord, shall be put to death, even uttering the name of God. Then the high priest said to him, I adjure you, by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. And here Jesus connects his expected resurrection and ascension to heaven with his claims to be the Son of God. And this was unthinkable. It demanded the death penalty. And the same would go to his followers or disciples. The Babylonian Talmud also says that Jesus practiced sorcery. Well, the New Testament does not explicitly mention the charge of sorcery, but the first charge brought against Jesus by the false witnesses is the alleged claim that he is able to destroy the temple and to rebuild it in 3 days. Moreover, Jesus' practice of casting out demons is explicitly connected with the messianic claim and may indeed be presupposed in the trial before the high court. Why does the Talmud insist on the strange detail of the herald announcing the execution 40 days before it takes place? The plain answer it gives is to leave enough time for prospective witnesses in Jesus' defense to come forward and to argue against the accusation. But there might be another subtext here that, again, subtly, or rather not so subtly, responds to the New Testament narrative. There, Jesus foretells his disciples 3 times that he will be killed and resurrected in 3 days, the last time on his way to Jerusalem before the Passion begins, that is shortly before Passover. And that reads, they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the high priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again. And emphasizing that the herald announces Jesus' execution, and not just immediately before it took place, but precisely 40 days in advance, the Bavli directly contradicts Jesus' own prediction. Why all this fuss about him playing the prophet by dramatically prophesying his trial, sentence, and death? Not only once, but 3 times. The last time, even a few days before it was about to happen. We all know the Talmud counters that he was going to be executed because the Jewish court had made this decision in public proceedings, as is customary in the Jewish law. And to proclaim publicly 40 days before the execution, which is an unusually long time, it's not required in the Mishnah, so that everybody could know it, and if necessary, had ample time to come up with exonerating evidence to prevent a wrong judgment. Hence, in providing the 40-day period, the Bavli intends to expose Jesus once more as a swindler and false prophet who makes a fool of himself and claiming to predict what everybody already knew. Now, here's where it gets really, really interesting. Now, the death penalty and execution. Here we have a major discrepancy between the New Testament and the Talmud. According to the New Testament, Jesus was crucified, obviously following Roman law, whereas according to the Talmud, he was stoned and hanged, following rabbinic law. The reason for this, of course, was the simple fact that the Sanhedrin could not impose and execute the death penalty, but had to rely on the Roman authority, which followed Roman and non-rabbinic law. So, shall we conclude from this that the Talmud does not preserve any reliable evidence about the historical trial and execution of Jesus, and instead imposes on him later rabbinic law? Well, of course, yes. But again, this is the wrong question. Not the historical execution. Crucifixion versus stoning or hanging is at stake here. But the question of why the Talmud regards it as a matter of course, or rather insists that Jesus was executed according to rabbinic law. And to answer this question, the rabbis were certainly aware that crucifixion was the standard Roman death penalty, that Jesus was indeed crucified and not stoned and hanged, hence why their stubborn insistence on the latter, because this is precisely the core of their polemical counter-narrative to the Gospels. The author of a Bavli does not need to distort the New Testament report as such. The fact that Jesus was put on trial and executed like an ordinary criminal was devastatingly enough. Such a story can hardly be made any worse. Instead of the two, and indeed conflicting stories about Jesus' trial in the New Testament, he chose the Jewish one and completely ignores the Roman one. Unlike Pilate, who emphasizes the political part of the charge against Jesus, our Bavli author adopts and interprets the version of the trial before the Sanhedrin, accusation and condemnation of a blasphemer and idolater who leads astray all of Israel. We, the Jews, he argues, have put him on trial and executed him for what he was, which was a blasphemer, who claimed to be God and deserved the capital punishment according to our Jewish law. With this deliberate misreading of the New Testament narrative, the Bavli claims Jesus for the Jewish people, but only to fend off once and for all any claim by himself or his followers. Yes, indeed, the Bavli admits Jesus was a Jewish heretic. He was quite successful in seducing many of us, but he was taken care of according to the Jewish law, got what he deserved, and that's the end of the story. Days before the execution to ask for other witnesses. This detail does not belong, but it is the answer to the later objection. In all 4 Gospels, Pilate, the Roman governor, tries to save Jesus. Thus, one can indeed get the impression that Jesus had no less powerful a protector than the governor himself. Pilate explicitly makes a great effort to convince the Jews that he hasn't found any case against him and wants to release him, but the Jews won't give in. It is again the Gospel of John that is particularly specific in this regard. If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. So the Jews play the Roman governor off against his master, the emperor, and that was the last thing in the world that Pilate needed, to be accused of disloyalty to the emperor. Jesus did not gain time, as the Talmud has it, but is immediately sentenced and executed. So there's a direct contradiction there. Now there's a whole lot more in this book, but that was a very brief overview and quick discussion of the book Jesus and the Talmud. Peter Schäfer is a prolific German scholar of ancient religious studies who has made contributions to the field of ancient Judaism and early Christianity. Where he was born, his education. He was a professor of Judaic studies and professor of religion. His teaching and research interests have focused on Jewish history and late antiquity, the religion and literature of rabbinic Judaism, Jewish mysticism, 19th and 20th century. So if you're interested in reading this book, which is a gem, I will link it in the bottom of the description box where you can buy it off Amazon.